Hello, my name is Allison Carmen, and welcome to my podcast, 10 Minutes to Less Suffering. And the name of today's podcast is We Don't Need to Judge Our Suffering. And this reminds me of a story of when I was out to lunch with a bunch of friends. We were sitting there and we were speaking, and one of my friends was very upset that she had a falling out with a relative. And for much of our lunch, she was talking about it, and you could see that she was really suffering. And when she left the lunch, my other friend said to me, she has a great job. She has all the money that she needs. She really doesn't have a right to be suffering this much in her life. And I understood the friend that was speaking was having a hard time at work, and she had a lot of debt. But at the same time, we really can't judge someone else's suffering. We could talk about people taking responsibility for things that they do. We could talk about cause and effect, but suffering is very personal. And it reminds me of a passage in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a psychotherapist, and he was a survivor of the Holocaust. And he writes in his book, to draw an analogy, a man's suffering is similar to the behavior of a gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. And I told that quote to my friend that I was sitting there at lunch, and she paused and she says, Allison, you're right. I think because I'm having a hard time and I'm struggling, my heart has been a little closed, and maybe I was a little envious of stuff that was going on in her life. And yet, just because she has good things happening in her life doesn't mean she doesn't have a right to suffer. And it's so important that we get this. Because if we just think about our lives and what we're going through and our own suffering, we don't realize that whether other people suffering is big or little, it is like gas and it fills up our tank. We could have more compassion for our neighbors and our friends and the people we work with and people all over the world. Who are we to judge when everybody has a different background, different traumas, and we can't ask people not to feel. We can't ask people not to want their lives to be a certain way. And when we keep our heart open, we could be there for other people. And we don't need to compare who's suffering more. And also, there's no point in judging other people's suffering because the only thing that we can control is our own suffering. And we know that the Buddha said that all attachments lead to suffering. And so to be free of suffering is to be free of attachments. But there are many things in life that we really care about: our children, our friends, our family, our job, paying our mortgage. And if we are suffering with something in our lives, we also shouldn't judge ourselves. Viktor Frankl also said in his book, but there was no need to be ashamed of tears. For tears bore witness that a man had the greatest of courage, the courage to suffer. We don't realize that it takes courage to show up for so many things in our lives and to keep our heart open. And if we're emotional and we're crying and we feel very vulnerable, it doesn't mean that we're weak. And it doesn't mean that we can't handle our lives. In fact, we are showing up. And yes, there comes a point in time that we look at our lives. I know I told the story in a previous podcast. Years ago, I thought that I might be sick and I ended up being okay. But when I didn't know what was going on, I suffered. And as I was suffering, I kept using my tools. And our tools are perspective. Sometimes we lose perspective of our lives. And so when we gain perspective, we reevaluate what's important and what's not, and sometimes that lessens our suffering. We could practice gratitude, which is similar to the idea of perspective, but we look at all the wonderful things that are happening in our lives so the things that bother us don't take center stage. That could reduce our suffering. And sometimes our suffering is because we're worried about the future, because we're stuck in the past, because we're not truly present. And we can use the practice of maybe and realize that uncertainty is our ally, because if we want our life to change, it has to happen in the unknown. So even though the suffering filled up our tank, eventually we could use different practices to open the window and let it out. But to judge others and to judge ourselves for just experiencing life and having pain because we're upset about things that we care about, it's just going to cause all of our hearts to close. Deep down, we all want to feel safe. We all want to feel loved. We want to know that our families are safe. We want to know that we have food and a place to live. And when things don't go our way, or people that we care about are going through a hard time, or when we're going through a hard time, or we don't feel whatever it is, we suffer. And we shouldn't be ashamed of our tears, because if we are showing up for life, if we are showing up for ourselves, if we are showing up for the people we care about, if we are waking up and trying every day, then we are courageous. And I actually found both my friends at that meal were courageous, because they both were facing things. And I hope in the days to come, they will gain perspective and gratitude, and they will go to the maybe practice, because if you're friends with me, I talk about it all the time. And for those of you who are not familiar with the maybe practice, you could listen to so many of my other podcasts. But the theory is, if you don't know what's going to happen next, that good things happen too. And within the unknown is maybe and hope that things can change and things can get better. So I just wanted to talk about this today, so we become less harsh on how we're viewing other people in our lives and where we live and in the world, and understand the similarities of suffering and how everybody has their own experience of it. It's like gas, it just fills up the tank, big or small. And again, we could talk about people being responsible for things that they do, and we could talk about cause and effect, and we can talk about all those things. But who are we to judge another person's suffering? Who are we to judge a mother's suffering, a father's suffering, a child's suffering? It's the one thing we all have in common. And we also have love in common, which can overcome our suffering. And again, perspective and gratitude and maybe, those are all universal things that we can all apply to our suffering. But the most important thing is that we keep our hearts open to ourselves and not judge ourselves and to others, because that's how we have compassion, and that's how we have empathy, and that's how the world becomes a more loving and more peaceful place. And at the end of the day, it's not whether or not someone is suffering, it's how do they experience their suffering and what do they decide to do with it? Do they decide to grow from it? Do they love more deeply? Do they overcome it? Do they find meaning in it? And there's nothing wrong with tears, and there's nothing wrong with showing how we truly feel. And the most courageous thing that we can do is to stay open-hearted and to stay kind and find a way to love this world into tomorrow. And remember, because we don't know the future, maybe everything will be okay. Maybe in the days to come, there will be less suffering and more peace. And most of all, for all of us, I hope, maybe the best is yet to come. Thank you for listening to this podcast today. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you could email me at allison@allisoncarmen.com. If you'd like to buy my books, The Gift of Maybe or A Year Without Men, they're available at all major bookstores and online retailers. And if you'd like to listen to the audiobook for The Gift of Maybe, it's available at all major audio platforms. And if you like this podcast, I hope you subscribe and leave a comment.